if they are thinking that they are going to do through negotiations what Biden and Blinken and Sullivan and Newland and all the rest of the morons running our policy with respect to NATO and Ukraine for the 4 years of the Biden administration through negotiations, that they're going to cause Russia to do things like break up its alliances, back away from people like Iran, like China. He didn't say China, nor others. That's nonsense. That's sheer nonsense. You're not going to use these negotiations to do anything other than stop the killing in Ukraine, recognize that Russia has won, and get out the best way you possibly can otherwise. That's the only way you're going to do this with Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov. That's it. He's operating in the theater of the absurd. And I don't mean necessarily Jean-Paul Sartre's theater or Albert Camus' theater of the absurd. That was an artistic concept that worked fairly well. He's in a true theater of the absurd. Lavrov will eat his lunch, and probably almost any other Russian negotiator worth Putin's time will eat his lunch. I can't believe that he's even the negotiator, if that's his attitude. So to think the insinuation there is that we're going to solve all these other problems we couldn't solve through bleeding Ukraine bloodless by negotiations. I hope Trump hasn't been saying that sort of thing to him or to anyone for that matter. You're not going to do that, Donald. And that means if he doesn't get anywhere close to that, he'll, like he did with Kim Jong-un, just abandon it and leave it hanging in the wind. And that's not what we want here. We want a ceasefire, an end of the war, a peace agreement, and something that we can live with. We and the Europeans can live with, despite the Europeans' objections to it. They're going to have to live with it, particularly if Trump carries out some of the things Hegseth and J.D. Vance have said that portend for the U.S., NATO, U.S.-European relationship. Ain't going to be the same in the future, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't care what they personally or politically got invested in this deal with Ukraine. Ukraine's got hundreds of thousands of lives, and so does Russia invested in it. And we've been responsible for a lot of that, and it needs to come to a close. You hear that, Europeans? You hear that, NATO? You hear that, Brussels? And so let's do it as fast as we can. Now, I wish Rubio were saying the same things, similar things about Syria. You know, we haven't lifted our sanctions there yet. And that is excruciatingly difficult for Syria to operate with these incredible draconian sanctions we have on them. Assad is long gone. Let's lift the sanctions there too. And Marco, while you're looking at sanctions, Mr. Secretary, maybe you could look over the other 2 billion people we have in the world under our sanctions, some of them incredibly crushing, and some of them, like on Cuba, as a state sponsor of terrorism, for absolutely no reason. They haven't sponsored terrorism if they ever did in 40 years. But that's Mr. Rubio's pet peeve, Cuba. You think we're going to lift sanctions there? You know, let's get smart, Mr. Secretary. Let's lift sanctions majorly around the world and gain some stature back for doing it. They don't understand what they're talking about at the same time that Trump is trying to bring a close to this theater of war. And I don't care what they personally think or what kind of politics they have invested in it. Their politics are going out the window within the next 6 months, some of them earlier than that. And Zelensky should have been seen as the leading force or voice for that, because that's the only way you reestablish some modicum of constitutionality for Ukraine, is that they have elections and they have a new president. I don't know why they're putting it off to October. It doesn't make any sense. It should have been yesterday. Why is he so committed to what is a totally failed situation? I don't understand. Maybe it's the money. Maybe it's the graft. Maybe it's the power. But he now is presenting a picture to the world of a man who is slightly deranged. Maybe they're promising him a dacha outside London or something. I don't know. But remember, this is the same guy who campaigned and won a resounding victory on making sure that everything was copacetic with respect to Russia. That is to say, no war, etc. That's how he won. That's how he campaigned. That's how he won. the Royal Navy now is so small that it is not even a shadow of its former self. So Starmer talks idiotically. I mean, let's face it, he talks idiotically. And he hasn't been listening to Donald Trump, and he hasn't been listening to J.D. Vance and to Pete Hegseth, or he thinks he's coming to Washington and change their minds. I got news for him. He is not. Let's look at what's developing here now. You have got Donald Trump saying, and having said many times before in his first term, you need to pay more to be members of NATO. We're tired of bearing your burden. We might back out if you don't pay more. Threat, threat, threat. They are not paying more by a margin of difference. I mean, even though, who was it? Stoltenberg. Yeah, Jen Stoltenberg stood up at the Munich Security Conference, I think, or on the flanks of it, and started talking about how they were all at 2% or they were headed towards 2% and they would go beyond. Well, let's examine that for a moment. What Trump wants, if they go to 3 or 4 or better 5% of GDP, which is, again, no measure of a contribution. Anyway, GDP is stupid to use because your GDP grows over time and you might have the same security commitments. So what does 2% mean in 2024? What does 2% mean in 2030? It might be double what you were doing at that time if your GDP is growing, which it normally does. So it's a stupid measure. Put that aside for a second. If Starmer could find enough troops to actually put them on the ground in Ukraine and have British insignia on their helmets or hats, I'd be really surprised. I was talking to a couple of people this morning about this very issue, and while I did not disagree with them that the British had the most professional army in Europe and NATO, professional army, it was so tiny that it would be lucky if it could put a division minus on the ground in Ukraine. And then it would have stripped Britain of everything that it has in terms of a military defense, other than the other accoutrements. And they don't have many of those either. I think they have about, I think if Europe wants to save itself and protect itself in the same voice or same word, it needs to do that. It needs to grow up. It needs to grow up. It needs to divest itself from Washington, not in a visceral sense, but in the sense of I am my own entity now. I can defend myself. I can do all the things that states should do without having to rely on you. I like the fact that you have 5,000 nuclear weapons, and maybe I could talk you into going down on that too as we meet and deal with nuclear weapons. After all, we have some nuclear powers too, France and Britain. Ooh. And maybe Turkey very soon. Pakistan is talking to Turkey about how would you like to have a nuclear weapon? Fidan didn't talk about that, but I read it between the lines and a couple of things he said. And I have some friends in Islamabad that I know from the A.Q. Khan days, the father of the Muslim bomb. And I know how they still itch to get the bomb out to more Muslim countries. I think they've already made a contract with Saudi Arabia. Should Iran get a nuclear weapon, even though it's a Muslim country, it's a different kind of Muslim country. And I think they've already made a contract with Saudi Arabia. But I'm hearing that there are talks going on between Ankara and Islamabad also about that. This is not a good development, in my view. I think we ought to be going the other way, reducing the number of nuclear weapons owning states. But it may be a reality. The moment Iran is identified as having a nuclear weapon, 20 bombs will come to Saudi Arabia from Pakistan. And whoop, equality right there already off the bat. I've said that 3 years ago. NATO has no future. It has no future for one simple, easy to understand reason. There is no threat except themselves. That's one reason why Ukraine is such a farcical situation and why David Petraeus and a host of other American uniform-wearing, star-wearing military professionals were idiots over the past 3 or 4 years, talking about how Ukraine was so essential to the defense of Europe and so forth and so on. That is hogwash. It's not essential to the defense of Europe at all. Putin has no intention of going anywhere else. Putin did what he did because we caused him to do it. And we have been using that essentially to bleed Russia as we bled Ukraine viciously. And now people are beginning to realize that, to a certain extent anyway. It's beginning to dawn on them that this is really a very stupid policy. We're destroying NATO. If it was untenable to start with, once we passed 24, 25, 26 countries, it became untenable, absolutely untenable. Plus, there's no threat. So you just got a meeting house for people to jaw-jack and to sell equipment, which is really what Washington liked. We could sell equipment. That's the reason we expanded. You know, Lockheed Martin wanted to sell all that equipment to lots more countries, and the only countries that looked like they might be vulnerable were in Europe. And so, we expanded them, and they gave a lot of money to Bill Clinton's campaigns. That's not a foundation for an alliance, certainly not one that had the foundation NATO had, which was essentially a cataclysmic twilight struggle between a monolith in Moscow and a monolith in Washington, with two diametrically opposed philosophies, economic and ideologically. Gone. And so it's all falling apart. And anybody with any brain would have known that it was going to fall apart without that threat to keep it together. And I blame it principally on the neoconservatives in America and on the Biden administration's tolerance of them, entertainment of them, and having them in such key positions. That's what did this to us and to Europe. Now, Europe's got to pick up the pieces for itself. And to a certain extent, we do for ourselves. And Trump and J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, to their credit, have at least in this matter begun to do that. I wait to see how it turns out because, like I said before, he had a marvelous thing going with Kim Jong-un, unlike any other previous president, and he screwed it. And he made a real mess of our alliance with South Korea. But the reason that president is in jail now, or wherever he is because he was the last vestige of people supporting us in a way that was contravening the real attitude of the Korean people. They thought Trump was going to bring unification of the peninsula and peace finally to a war that started in 1950 and isn't over yet. They thought that was going to happen, especially Koreans under 40. And he screwed it. He screwed it by coming in, doing what he should do, getting their hopes up, and then leaving. Let's don't do that with Ukraine, please, Mr. President. And the problem now, and we should have started this much earlier, we started it in 1992 and 93, and Bill Clinton ruined it. We should have started disassembling NATO and reassembling something that would look like a viable relationship between Europe and us. And the most important part of that is to give Europe its own security identity, backed by the United States, particularly our nuclear umbrella, essentially its own. Let them grow up, in other words. Let them grow up. I've said that about my Japanese friends for years now. You know, finally the Japanese started growing up, but one wonders if they're going to grow up properly given the time that they spent under our nuclear umbrella and essentially under our defense umbrella, particularly during the Cold War. But, you know, the world changes, Nima. It changes, and you have to watch those changes and accommodate them, particularly if you're a freaking empire bent on dominating everyone like we are. The Japanese have very professional forces, very good Navy, very good Air Force, good equipment. They do a lot of it themselves. That's the Japanese way. But I'm worried very much about how they are going to handle being completely grown up. Are they going to build nuclear weapons, for example? They could do it in a heartbeat. They have such a complex. They probably have the most sophisticated nuclear complex in the world, with maybe France being right there with them. But they could build out in a year and be a complete stand-up nuclear weapon-owning state with submarines, with bombers, and with ballistic missiles. Wouldn't be any problem at all. But I worry about that because we didn't let them mature properly before they get to this point. And they know that. And that's the real reason they haven't broken out yet. I would say the kindest comment I heard, and giving Trump his due, I think, is that they thought he got confused about wanting to help people who were in extreme duress, notwithstanding the fact that he and the man next to him in that Oval Office meeting, anyway, Netanyahu, were responsible for that duress. But that's beside the point with Trump. That was a genuine show of concern about the people. That's the kindest remark I've heard. You can look like you have the other. You can look like you have passionate hatred or whatever, but you don't really have it. What you're worried about is you're losing money or you're gaining money, or you're gaining traction politically or you're losing traction politically. That, I think those are the only calculations that really matter to Trump. I know it sounds weird, but I've met people like that before in my life. They're different kinds of brains. I think there is a reason if Trump has animosity toward any individual. I think we were looking at that individual in that scene in the Oval Office. I don't think he likes Bibi Netanyahu at all. I really think, I like John Mearsheimer, I like Steve Walt. Most of the things they say I agree with. I really think in some ways they did a disservice in trying to pin everything on the Israel lobby. I don't think the Israel lobby has any blame for what happens in the United States, except the total takeover of the sycophant Congress and some other aspects of that. I think Israel is our tool to keep the Levant and hegemony therein. That's what I think is going on. I don't think that their tail wags the dog. I think we are the dog. I'm sad to say this. The recently confirmed new DNI is of this same nature, Tulsi Gabbard, who were telling him differently. They're giving him a different history. They're giving him a different picture of what's happening in the region, a different picture of Israel. If you've gone on a tour in Israel and gone on that bus with Israelis briefing you, and you know the real situation and the real history, you want to open the bus window and puke. It's disgusting what they do. But most people don't know anything. And so they're being impregnated with that message very carefully and very successfully by the Israeli tour guides and the Israeli people who accompany these showpiece trips. They even take you to the Golan, for example, below it, and tell you to look up there and imagine tanks or artillery up there, and how insignificant Israel is below, and how utterly dangerous it would be for Israel if an enemy would occupy those heights. Well, the question you want to ask is, why would an enemy want to occupy those heights? Because you're here, and because you've been here for 75 years, and you stole the land. They don't know that history. That's what Putin has been giving repeatedly, is a realistic appraisal of the battlefield. And it is all in his favor and not at all in Ukraine's favor. In fact, it's in Ukraine's disfavor. And on top of all of that, he's right about Zelensky. He's an illegitimate ruler. There is no way that he's legitimate. The Ukrainians need to ask him and then make him, if necessary, step down and hold elections and have a new leader who could come into this new environment created by Hegseth and Trump and capitalize on it. I take that characterization for what it's worth in terms of the general concept of Ukraine and the war there. But he's wrong, and badly wrong, about who used whom. We use Zelensky. He did not use us. Just as we are using Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not using us. But I understand what the empire wants in the Levant and what it uses Israel to do. And I understand what Biden, as a representative of the empire, and I think it was more Blinken and Sullivan, wanted to use Ukraine to do. And it had nothing to do with Zelensky. In fact, Zelensky in the beginning, if you realize what he was like in the beginning, and I have no love for him now, especially, but in the beginning, he campaigned and won a sizable majority of the vote on not going to war with Russia. And then he had the opportunity to stop it after it had started and was ready to sign, and we talked him out of it. I mean, let's face it. Even if we come to a reasonable settlement with respect to Ukraine, they have lost big time. But more importantly, for that guy you just played, NATO and Washington have lost majorly. And Trump has acknowledged it. And you can't hold an alliance, political and military, like that one together without a real threat. and it has no threat. And the Europeans are falling apart, just falling apart. I listened to a French conservative yesterday who speaks fluent English, and he just went on. He said, the Europeans are like rabbits. I'm driving down through the southern part of France at night. My headlights are on, and the rabbits are in the road running around all over the place. That's the way we are. That's the way we are. And van der Leyen is out there saying she's going to do her 16th rounds of sanctions on Russia. Okay, madam, where's your army? He then went on to say the entire European complex, NATO members minus the United States and Turkey, could not put 50,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine. He's right. Now we have people who are only concerned with the United States getting them out of every stinking mess they might get themselves into. Maybe we bred this with the Balkans. I don't know. It's not going to happen. And it's certainly not going to happen with Donald Trump. If they turn on themselves now and just wind up in some kind of inside European typical struggle, he'll back out completely. He'll leave completely. We'll have an economic relationship, a trade relationship, and he'll start putting tariffs on them big time too. But we won't have any other kind of relationship. And that's probably dangerous, I think. We need to maintain some kind of transatlantic link, and it needs to be reasonably sound. And it needs to be a little bit more than just economics and finance. But I'm afraid we might be headed for that. It's going to depend to a certain extent on Macron is not the leader of France. He is not. They've shown that now. For weeks on end, they've shown that. He needs to get out. They need to have a new government. Certainly the Chancellor of Germany is not their leader. And February 23rd, we're going to find out. We're going to ripple through these elections, and other people are going to be elected. I don't know what's going to happen in Romania, where Colin is running and should be the lead candidate if it weren't for the EU and the CIA messing up the elections. That'd be another Orban. As I've said many times, there needs to be a substantial effort by European leaders of consequence to establish a European security architecture. But I don't see anyone with the cojones even, let alone the intellectual weight to do that. We don't have the kind of people we had, for example, when I was dealing with the Europeans. Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, John Major, Maggie Thatcher, a host of other people in other countries who were as concerned with their own security and their own country's domestic and foreign situation as they were with NATO. And part of that problem is of our own making, because through the years, especially the latter years of the Cold War and just afterwards, we have become almost what do you call those things that little children have that they depend on all the time? Blinkies or something like that. NATO has become a blinky for Europe. They reach out for it. They don't do anything on their own. They can't think on their own. They can't make product on their own. They can't do defense matters on their own. They reach out to Washington all the time. No one's more exemplifying that than London. Well, they've got to get off that. And they've got to decide what they're going to do. Are we going to talk to 30 some odd different countries? Or are we going to talk to Berlin? Are we going to talk to an axis between Berlin and Paris? Are we going to talk to something else that might be created? I don't know. So we've got to move away from the old world and into the new world, the existing world. And Europe's got to make that move pretty fast, or they're just going to be a squabbling bunch of idiots, which is pretty much what I think to the world they are beginning to look like right now. That's what Europe's role in this probably is going to wind up being, because Donald Trump's not going to want to be interfered with. And I don't blame him from the perspective that as he's watched this develop from his perch in the campaign and now from being inaugurated, the Europeans have been nothing but a problem, especially Germany, France, Britain at the peak. Britain, who offers 100-day treaties for an army that you could put in a thimble. So I wouldn't want to be beleaguered by them either, were I going straight for the heart of things. Now, I don't for a moment pretend that Donald Trump is going to achieve going straight for the heart of things, because he's his own worst enemy. But this is a good way to start, in my view. This is a meeting that I think is part of Trump's plan, and I don't object to it. I don't know what's going to happen there. I wish I did, but I don't object to it. He's going there, or his envoys are going there, and Sergei Lavrov and Putin's envoys are going there. Maybe Lavrov even, I don't know. I haven't heard anything definitive about the Russian delegation yet. But they're going there to talk about what is central to them. And as far as they're concerned, they need to do it without interference from the EU or the Europeans, or even, for that matter, from NATO, and without any interference from Zelensky in particular, but Ukraine in general. I don't discount that. A good first move. Well, obviously, President Macron found it to be not to his liking, so he held a meeting in Paris, which one of my good friends who knows Europe better than I said this morning. He quoted Horace, which in the poem sort of turns out like this: "They went to the mountain and they met a mouse." That's what Macron achieved in Paris. Nobody gave him any real heed. I think they do need to reevaluate their kowtowing to Washington over having limited economic relations with China. I think that's the future. And I think that's the future for everyone. And I don't mean that China dominates everyone. I mean that it's mutually reinforcing. It's a win-win game. But the first thing I would do, and I'm going to narrow it for you for just a moment, because this is my field. I'm going to narrow it to military matters. The first thing I would do, and I don't know if this guy Merz, who's the former BlackRock CEO coming in probably to be the new chancellor of Germany after the elections, I don't know if he has this skill or not, but I would convene in Berlin. I wouldn't do it in Paris. I would not do it in Paris. And people say, oh no, don't you remember World War II? Screw World War II. It's way back there. It's so far back. I was born in 1945. I'm 80 years old. Good Lord. Okay, screw World War II. In Berlin, I would convene a defense conference, and I would invite all the leaders of Europe of consequence and anyone others that want to come along and observe, like Estonia and Latvia. And I would say, okay, we are going to design, build, construct, put together, however you want to say it, a European security identity. And oh, by the way, I'm the new chancellor of Germany. By the way, I'm going to reach out there to Moscow, and I'm going to ask them to at least be observers as we do this, with the intention that eventually they will probably be a member of this new security architecture. Anybody got any objections? Start the process. Start the process. And if somebody like Starmer comes along and objects, tell him, you're not even a member of the EU. Get the hell out of my shop, or whatever. I would be pretty brusque about it if I were the leader in Berlin. And I would let everybody know that this is going to happen, and it's going to happen on my watch, at least the start of it. I think that would send a signal out to the world, particularly to Washington and the other way too, that times have changed, that Europe has finally grown up, 740 million people potential with a $23 trillion GDP, annual GDP. We're going to get our act together financially, economically, socially, culturally, and most of all, security-wise. You can lump it or like it, Washington. And in a sense, don't give the back of your butt to Washington. Just let them know what you're doing, and let them know unequivocally that you're going to do it, despite what they say. Invite their help if necessary, invite their attention, invite observers, but don't be beholden to Washington. Put together your own security mechanism in Europe. Establish the percentages that people have to contribute, all the things that go into doing that. Take a decade if you need to, but do that and let the world know you're doing that. You know, we won't like that. We won't like that because we have enough sense to see what a competitor that's going to be in almost every field of power. And, you know, that's the old heartland theory, you know. He who owns the heartland owns the world. I don't think that's very viable today, though, because the heartland is moving in toward Beijing. What Trump wants them to use that increased spending for is to buy American products like F-35s and F-16s and our Patriot batteries. Check out the European leaders. They want to make their own defense equipment, and rightfully so. They don't want to buy the equipment from the United States. Sorry, that's what Trump is talking about. He doesn't want you to just increase your percentage He wants you to buy American equipment, make you even more dependent on the United States. That's one part. Second part, if they go to 5% or even 4%, bye-bye social programs. Bye-bye those programs in Europe, which from Denmark to France make the difference politically often, and certainly make the difference in people's lives, and make the Danes so happy that they become the #1 country in the world each year for contentment of the population. You're not going to do that anymore. So put that aside, because you can't afford those social programs if you're spending that much on defense. So see how preposterous this all is? It's preposterous. And what's it going to wind up boiling down to? It's going to boil down to the dissolution of NATO, the fracturing of the transatlantic link, Europe squabbling with itself as it tries to put together a European security architecture. And no way they're going to do that soundly, firmly, and with expectations for success in the future without Russia. Russia has got to be a member of that European security architecture. Do you think any of those leaders right now, other than maybe Orban and maybe Colin in Romania, if he manages to get elected, and maybe in Slovakia, I don't know, do you think any of the rest of them will be in favor of bringing Russia into the new European security architecture? No, they'll be squabbling and fighting, and we're supposed to hate Russia, they will say in Berlin. This has not got good prospects for the future, Nima. So what is it that is really important about NATO as NATO may become nothing more than a transactional agreement with Germany or some other state like Italy, where we have all these assets that are absolutely necessary for global projection of power. Read War with China, they would be essential. So I can see that devolving out of this, and we would make individual bilateral, more or less, relationships with some of these countries that have critical assets like Ramstein and like Aviano in Italy in them, which are not really there for NATO anymore. They're there for the Mediterranean and beyond. Ramstein Air Force Base is a very critical asset for the United States military's projection of power. And that's not just for Europe. In fact, it is less so for Europe than any other place. That projection of power is for the Mediterranean. We're building things right now, much to the Italian government's chagrin a couple of years ago when they objected to it. We are building things in Italy, for example. We have things, as I'm indicated in Ramstein, that have nothing to do with NATO and Europe. They have everything to do with the Levant, everything to do with that little pipsqueak at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, that tyrant of a state called Israel. So I don't care what they personally or politically got invested in this deal with Ukraine. Ukraine's got hundreds of thousands of lives, and so does Russia invested in it. And we've been responsible for a lot of that, and it needs to come to a close. You hear that, Europeans? You hear that, NATO? You hear that, Brussels? And so let's do it as fast as we can. Now, I wish Rubio were saying the same thing, similar things about Syria. We haven't lifted our sanctions there yet. And that is excruciatingly difficult for Syria to operate with these incredible draconian sanctions we have on them. Assad is long gone. Let's lift the sanctions there too. And Marco, while you're looking at sanctions, Mr. Secretary, maybe you could look over the other 2 billion people we have in the world under our sanctions, some of them incredibly crushing, and some of them, like on Cuba, as a state sponsor of terrorism, for absolutely no reason. They haven't sponsored terrorism if they ever did in 40 years. But that's Mr. Rubio's pet peeve, Cuba. You think we're going to lift sanctions there? Let's get smart, Mr. Secretary. Let's lift sanctions majorly around the world and gain some stature back for doing it. They don't understand what they're talking about at the same time that Trump is trying to bring a close to this theater of war. And I don't care what they personally think or what kind of politics they have invested in it. Their politics are going out the window within the next 6 months, some of them earlier than that. And Zelensky should have been seen as the leading force or voice for that, because that's the only way you reestablish some modicum of constitutionality for Ukraine, is that they have elections and they have a new president. Um, I don't know why they're putting it off to October. It doesn't make any sense. It should have been yesterday. Why is he so committed to what is a totally failed situation? I don't understand. Maybe it's the money. Maybe it's the graft. Maybe it's the power. But he now is presenting a picture to the world of a man who is slightly deranged. Maybe they're promising him a dacha outside London or something. I don't know. But remember, this is the same guy who campaigned and won a resounding victory on making sure that everything was copacetic with respect to Russia. That is to say, no war, etc. That's how he won. That's how he campaigned. That's how he won. The Royal Navy now is so small that it is not even a shadow of its former self. So Starmer talks idiotically. I mean, let's face it, he talks idiotically. And he hasn't been listening to Donald Trump, and he hasn't been listening to J.D. Vance and to Pete Hegseth, or he thinks he's coming to Washington and change their minds. I got news for him. He is not. Let's look at what's developing here now. You have got Donald Trump saying, and having said many times before in his first term, you need to pay more to be members of NATO. We're tired of bearing your burden. We might back out if you don't pay more. Threat, threat, threat. They are not paying more by a margin of difference. I mean, even though, who was it? Stoltenberg. Yeah, Jens Stoltenberg stood up at the Munich Security Conference, I think, or on the flanks of it, and started talking about how they were all at 2% or they were headed towards 2% and they would go beyond. Well, let's examine that for a moment. What Trump wants, if they go to 3 or 4 or better 5% of GDP, which is, again, no measure of a contribution. Anyway, GDP is stupid to use because your GDP grows over time and you might have the same security commitments. So what does 2% mean in 2024? What does 2% mean in 2030? It might be double what you were doing at that time if your GDP is growing, which it normally does. So it's a stupid measure. Put that aside for a second. If Starmer could find enough troops to actually put them on the ground in Ukraine and have British insignia on their helmets or hats, I'd be really surprised. I was talking to a couple of people this morning about this very issue, and while I did not disagree with them that the British had the most professional army in Europe and NATO, professional army, it was so tiny that it would be lucky if it could put a division minus on the ground in Ukraine. And then it would have stripped Britain of everything that it has in terms of a military defense, other than the other accoutrements. And they don't have many of those either. I think they have about